the house. Pat McCreery. Stands for nicest man ever. We'll have to tell you the story some other time. So I just call him Enemy for short. Pat, we are honored to have Pat here today. The work he's been doing since he was chosen as our equity administrator, but honestly, before that, as an instructor, he is embarrassingly good. I had so many of my students, I taught sort of alongside him very, very briefly at Westview, but I've known him as in the TOSA role for social studies, and he's just an amazing guy all the way around. And I think what we're going to do today, I hope, will really take us on our journey of equity and inclusion, get us started on a really good foot. I know we've done some work. It's a part of who we are and what we need to embed in our all of our systems, decisions, and processes. We invited Pat to come in to sort of help us really kickstart what we're doing and give us a place to start. And thank you so much for being here, Pat, and take it away. Appreciate it.
Sure. Paul, I got to say, I'm inclined to ask you to just keep going with the compliments because that felt really good. And then the other part of me kind of just wants to say goodbye right now because I don't think I can top that. So thanks, everybody. It's been a hoot. No, I got to admit, I am looking around at the faces and there are some wonderful new faces to all of you who I have not yet met. I don't use this word real often. I hate that we're living in a world where I'm meeting you first virtually, and I long for the opportunity to get to meet you in person. Although this is the one school where I'm not sure how I would get to meet you all in person, because you are all existing in a wonderful new format. And to those of you who I do know, I'm going to admit to being a little terrified because some of you have known me. Well, one of you in this room has known me my entire life. Some of you have known me for a lot longer, and I'm going to ask that any stories you know of, please use discretion in sharing them. If they are the good ones, you have my permission. If not, maybe just in private chat, if you wouldn't mind doing that. But I appreciate being asked to come. Sarah and Paul and Jessica and I got to meet a little bit to talk about maybe what I could offer to staff. I'm also really excited to see so many current and former members of our equity leadership teams, which I got to be part of and am facilitating now. And so just as a heads up, I've let some of you know, some of what we're going to be doing today is a little bit of repeat with what we've done in equity leadership teams, but it's the kind of stuff that I think is really, really good to keep going. And then also, Paul, just transparency and facilitation. I want to make sure not to overstep. I know on my calendar, we've got till 3:30. Is that correct on your end as well? And then do you want any time at the end to do any wrap up stuff with staff?
I think we're good. I trust your plan. Perfect.
Then I'm going to say with some glee that what we kind of developed together, to be honest, doesn't necessarily, I don't know that it'll necessarily take an hour and a half. It's designed to kind of facilitate discussion. So if we end up having some really rich discussions, that'd be great. If we end up not doing that and there's time for question and answer at the end, I'd love that as well. And then we can kind of see where things go. So with that, I think I'm going to share my screen, which I've learned in Zoom. I always like to let people know about because it feels a little invasive to me. And then those of you who know how to do the trick of, having me share it, but you really don't have to have it take over your screen. You can do what you want. And I think I shared it the wrong way. Are you seeing the slide deck or are you seeing a blue screen with a mountain in it? Looks like you said slide deck. You are seeing the slide deck. Okay, cool. Well, I'll start it then. Thanks, Sarah. I have upgraded to the laptop and then the monitor over here, but that doesn't mean my brain upgraded with how to use both of them at the same time. So just by means of introduction, and for those of you who know me, pretend this is the first time you've met me. But I had 24 years in a classroom. I've been in Beaverton my whole career, student taught during the 95-96 year in the second year that Westview High School was open, and was there for most of my career, well, all of my career till 2007. Then I got to be part of the team that helped open up Health Science School, now known as BASE. Was there for 4 years and then went back to Westview in 2011 and was there until August 27th of 2019 when I was able to take this role. Most of what I taught, it was all high school social studies. Most of it was ninth grade. I always joke kind of that I did that because I loved ninth grade the most. It's about my maturity level. But those of you who have ever taught ninth grade know that that age is both terrifying but mostly wonderful. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I got to serve as an instructional coach at TOSA for about 10 years in a variety of different roles. And Paul already mentioned some of them. Early on, I started as both a social studies and English language arts specialist. I was part-time doing both of those positions. So if any of you are familiar with the work that Matt Highfield, Brad Parker, and Casey Smith are doing, at one point it was deemed that that was work that combined equal to part-time position. So I'm glad not to be doing that anymore. And then for a long time, I got to be part of the district work around proficiency and then what became known as the standards-based learning system. So if you love learning targets, you're welcome. If you're not a fan of them, I'm sorry. But I got to be part of that work, and I really got kind of passionate about it. And that was one of my entry points for doing the equity work. And then for the past few years, I was one of our standards-based learning assessment TOSAs at the school. So I worked at Westview with a couple other folks and then cross-district with people. So that's my experience there. And then I'm going to kind of do something that Paul might have seen me do with students. I know some of you have as well. After about 20 years of teaching, I learned that on that first day of school, that spiel we do, which is oftentimes the same one we do at back to school night, where we tell students everything we think they want to know about us, usually does not include any of the things they want to know about us as a person. And so I am just going to stop and kind of open it up to the group and give you a chance to ask any questions you might have about me, about my work, about anything. And what I always say to students is, I'm comfortable being asked anything. If I'm not comfortable answering it, I'll let you know if it's too personal or something. But the reason I want to do this, to be transparent in what we're doing, is that we're going to talk about a topic today. You know, we're talking about something that falls into the category of anti-bias and anti-racism, racial equity. And when we ask people to talk about these things, we're asking for a degree of trust and confidence that I think is not fair to ask if you're not willing to give it as well. And so part of why I'm giving you space to ask me about anything you need to know is so that you can feel at least a base level of credibility on my part and trust in me before I ask you to share things that, to be honest, you could say I have no business asking you to share. So with that, I'm going to engage in a little bit of potentially awkward Zoom silence and see if you have any questions.
I do have one, Pat, because we asked all of our staff members this.
Sure.
We're really early on. What's your favorite breakfast?
Ooh, favorite breakfast. Paul, you stumped me. Savory, whatever it is, it's going to be savory. I've moved out of the sweet era of life. Can I just be general and say like a breakfast sandwich? It's sort of like lunch would probably be a burrito, and it doesn't really matter what's inside it. So just a breakfast sandwich of some kind. There'd be a bread, an egg, a cheese, maybe something like that.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, compact. Good question. Anything else folks want to know? That by the way was a softball. So feel free to go beyond that. Okay, y'all
I'll ask a question, Pat.
Go for it.
So what is it that made you decide, having also taught ninth grade global studies, and I understand the love, what is it that made you decide to move into the Office of Equity and Inclusion?
Jessica, good question. It's a long answer. So let me summarize it by saying, if I were to encapsulate it in a single word, it'd be frustration. I was frustrated with, and I'll be honest, because I've said it publicly, I was frustrated with our district because I like to think that I've been part of the equity work that's been going on throughout the district. I like to think since I've been a teacher. I didn't always have words for it, but I've always taught with an aim towards social justice. It's part of how I was raised. And so then when there was a name for it, and when I saw that in Beaverton that work was being done at a grassroots level, as many of you know, the equity work in Beaverton was kind of a coalition of the willing. It was never really, I think until this year, seen as a mandate. You know, we've never heard from someone like our superintendent saying things like, we are committed to this. And so given that, I had worked very closely with my predecessor, Shoshigeoka, in the position, largely facilitating the equity leadership teams and developing a lot of the resources that are on Teacher Source that, side note, need to be improved upon. And I know that that's on my list of things to do. And when I saw the position open up, initially I was very clear about not wanting it, but I did want to be part of the group that helped decide who was going to fill that role. And so I saw the district go through 2 postings of the position and not seem to want any of the folks that we were sending forward. And I heard from some folks that they thought I would be a good person in that role. And those of you who know me know that I'm kind of slow to make big decisions like that. I'm also slow to leave the things that I love. And so, full disclosure, I miss the students like crazy. It was a bit heartbreaking to leave that. But I saw an opportunity that I didn't want to go away. So I took it. And I've made it very clear, and I like to say this publicly so that y'all can help hold me accountable. There's a little joke on the slide that I'm showing that I'm in the Office of Equity and Inclusion. It's a population of 1 right now. I would love it if that population increased. And if it's not going to, I have made it very clear to our superintendent that I hope he keeps looking for someone even more qualified for this position. And the moment he finds them, feel free to send me, back into the classroom and let that person take it. So happy to be doing this right now. I don't mean to share that in any way to disparage the position. It's just, I'll be very honest. This is a position that should not have to exist. If our school system were doing what it needed to, this position should not exist, but it does. And so I'm happy to do it while it's there. I see Jason's question in the chat. Oh, thank you. And Jason, I forgot, in terms of how I identify, I use he, him pronouns, and I identify as white, mixed European, racially and ethnically. And then, do I feel that I'm at a disadvantage or advantage? It's a good question. Jason, I'll share. So this coming Friday, I get to have a meeting. I have a regular meeting with a group called the Oregon Equity Directors, and they are folks in my position in various districts across the state. The first meeting was a little awkward because I showed up as the new guy, and I was the one thing that didn't look like the others in terms of the skin that I'm in, and there's a notion that this position, when it exists in districts, is a position created for people who identify with the global majority or as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, which is problematic, right? I get that, and so there's layers of problem around that. So I would say I don't even know if it's fair to call it a disadvantage. An area that I'm aware of is that in this role, I have an added responsibility to show up for our colleagues of color, to show that I can represent and advocate for them. An advantage that I think I have is that as a straight cis white male, possibly somebody who enjoys more unearned privilege than anybody else in those categories, I have the ability to speak to other people who enjoy unearned privilege in a way that unfortunately some people don't. So I am listened to by people who might be resistant to similar ideas when they come from other people. So I'm hesitant to call that an advantage because that itself is a sign of systemic racism and sexism. But if I can use that to the benefit of our system and our students and our staff, then I'll take that. That was a really long answer to your question, Jason. I apologize. But thank you for asking that. Any other questions? I promise I didn't just come to be like interviewed, but I want to make sure to let y'all know who you're dealing with. If any of you have figured out the appropriate length of Zoom wait time, feel free to tell me. I have not yet. I had mastered it in the classroom, felt so good about it, but haven't figured it out in Zoom yet. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to move forward and suggest that if you have questions, I'm okay with people kind of blurting them out as we go. If you want to use the blue raise hand feature, go for it. Although I don't know that I'll be able to follow everybody along, and then feel free to use the chat, and we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. So a couple of thoughts I want to share with you. Some of you might be familiar with Cornelius Minor, one of my recent fanboy experiences. If you've read the book We Got This, it's hard not to like that one. Cornelius offers this quote: "When we think of race, gender, ability, or class-based oppression, we often think of individual acts of personal bias. We use words like racist or sexist to describe those people, as if those words were merely personality types or character flaws. They're not just character traits. Racism, sexism, ableism, and classism are systems. They're the rules, policies, procedures, practices, and customs that govern a place and lead to consistently unequal outcomes for specific subsets of people." And this is an important quotation for me, because as we talk about race and racism and anti-racism, we have to allow ourselves to get past what's called the binary belief of someone is either racist or not racist, right? It's not that simple. It's not a characteristic of who we are as people. It's a characteristic of the way that we operate within a larger system that offers different amounts of privilege to different people. And the reason it's important to get past that, as many of you probably know, is if we can't, then we shut ourselves off from the opportunity to learn. But if we see our agency within a system as being either perpetuating the racist elements of that system or actively mitigating them, and ideally doing away with them, then we see ourselves as having more agency. And so to me, it's a matter of feeling more empowered to do that. If someone calls me a racist and they're saying that that's part of my identity, I don't feel like I have anywhere I can go. But if they say that what I did perpetuated systemic racism, then I've got something I can do about that. And then I'm also a fan of finding quotations from uncommon sources. Marsha Warfield, if any of you are old enough like me to remember the show Night Court, she was a comedian who's on that show. And I heard an interview recently with her where she said, "You can't fix what you won't face." And I like to think that this is what we're doing. We're finally at a point, many of us have seen the examples or the effects of systemic racism for a long time. I feel like we're at a critical point where we're finally facing it. And we're facing it together, which to be honest, feels a whole lot better than feeling like you're facing it alone. So I want to go over some terms. I'm going to be a little teachery here, just to make sure we're dealing with a common vocabulary, because there are a lot of terms that get thrown around. As many of you know, we love acronyms in education, and these tend to get acronymized. Culturally relevant teaching is something that you've probably heard a lot about. We're going to talk a bit about it. It's a term and a concept that was made popular in the early 90s by Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. The term she created was defined as one that empowers students to maintain cultural integrity while succeeding academically. And so when we talk about culturally relevant teaching, we really draw upon the foundational work of Dr. Billings. One thing, there are some of you in here that I have taught with, and you've probably been in the room when I tell students not to use Wikipedia as a valid research source. Please know that I did include the citations. This little bit is from Wikipedia because sometimes it does it well, and I included the original source of information from it there too. So those of you who are going to be the research hounds and going to call me on that, I'm not a hypocrite with my students. I went to the real source. And then a bit later, Geneva Gay, as recently as 2010, brings us the term culturally responsive teaching, and defined it as using the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frames of reference, and performance styles of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant to and effective for them. And I share these terms because they're probably pretty familiar to you. Sometimes I do get asked, what's the difference between relevant and responsive? And I would argue it has to do with the amount of agency the student has in it. We're also currently hearing terms like culturally sustaining teaching, historically responsive teaching. So there's a lot of terms out there, and I would say if you're interested in sort of the PhD level analysis, by all means dig into them to find the differences. In the end, what I summarize it as is it's all just good teaching. It's best practices by focusing on the student and their identity first. That said, that's a generalization, and I want to acknowledge that. We also talk about educational equity. And as many of you know, equity in Beaverton, I'm going to go ahead and say equity is one of those terms that we are at risk, if we're not already there, of using so frequently that we have sort of watered down the meaning of it. I know that there's a lot of discussion around what it means to have equity as one of our 4 pillars. I've kind of suggested that maybe we need to change the visual metaphor, and I like the idea of equity being a foundation, or if we are going to keep it as a pillar, not that I've been to a circus in a long time, but if you can imagine a circus tent, I like the idea that equity is that pole in the middle that's holding up the others, and it's really the core of what we do. It's a measure of achievement, fairness, and opportunity in education. Educational equity depends on 2 main factors. The first is fairness, which implies that factors specific to one's personal conditions should not interfere with the potential of academic success. And the second important factor is inclusion, which refers to a comprehensive standard that applies to everyone in a certain education system. And then finally for today, anti-racism, probably the newest term, though it's not really a new one. It's been around, I think the first time I heard it was in reference to a quote by Angela Davis coming from the late 60s, early 70s. Being anti-racist is fighting against racism. Being anti-racist results from a conscious decision to make frequent, consistent, equitable choices daily. These choices require ongoing self-awareness and self-reflection as we move through life. Being racist or anti-racist is not about who you are, it's about what you do. And one of the, some of you might have read, or you might be familiar with Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. One of the things that I love in that book that I've really taken away is an analogy he uses. He says that terms like racist and anti-racist are like peelable name tags, and we're always wearing at least one of them, sometimes both of them, based on our actions. And so they're not necessarily qualities of who we are, but they're qualities of the actions that we do. And so just keeping in mind that we are always in our actions being either someone who is perpetuating racism, being racist, or being anti-racist. So quick little vocabulary lesson there. Any questions before we move on? Looking for hands. Okay. And by the way, one thing I forgot to mention at the very beginning, I was going to ask as a favor, since I'm brand new to doing this in a Zoom setting, I really value feedback, and I will say too that giving students opportunity at feedback is one example of culturally responsive practices. So Paul, I was going to ask, I don't know if you have any kind of way for folks to give you feedback, but I would love if people want to share with you stuff that resonated with them, stuff where they were like, man, don't bring that guy back. Feel free to share that with me if you would, because I'd love that.
Yep, thanks, we can do that.
Sure. And then, Paul, I wanted to check too, was this survey, have you shared this with staff already?
Nope, not yet.
Perfect, okay. So one of the things, just for kind of context of some of the larger scope of the work in the district, in the summer, August 20th, we had an all district leadership summit. And the focus was 100% on anti-racism and racial equity. And one of the things that I did to try to support our leaders throughout the district in schools and in departments was to develop a series of resources that they could use. I intentionally did not want to provide things that were sort of like checklist items, like here, do this and then do this, because our schools are at different places. I can even look in this room, and I know that many of you are at different places in this journey of understanding. So to be quite honest, it's not respectful to ask those of you who have been doing this work for longer to enter at the same point as everybody else. And that's part of culturally responsive teaching as well. So I offered a number of resources, and one of the ones that I think is most important is just an initial survey of staff to see where you're at in terms of your familiarity with racism and anti-racism, your comfort level with it, your interest in maybe being part of a group at the Flex online school that wants to focus on that. So what we wanted to do is actually give you time to take this survey, and here's where I'm going to be transparent in facilitation. I'm going to share the link to this survey in the chat, and then we want to give you some time to actually complete it, and then we're going to take some breakout room time for you to talk about things that came up for you. I have learned in Zoom, by the way, that I can't type and talk and copy and paste at the same time. So apologies. So I'm going to check to see, could somebody click on that link and tell me if it's opening correctly? hopefully it takes you to the live form and not the editable. Okay, so I'll tell you what, why don't we give you a couple of minutes. Why don't we say like 5 minutes? And if I could ask a favor, one way that I've done this in the past, if you wouldn't mind turning off your camera while you're completing the survey, and then turning it back on when you're done, that's going to help us know when you're ready to go. And then, Sarah, are you driving this thing?
In terms
Or,
of, I am
like for breakout rooms?
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm
so
arranging
I
them
don't
now.
know.
Or
Perfect. That's what I was gonna ask.
how many people is ideal?
I'd say like groups of about 4 would be great if you could. Okay, I see people coming back. So I would say if this were like a real staff meeting in a real building, this would just be that time where you can, stand up and stretch for a minute while we wait for everybody to finish. Go enjoy whatever snacks Paul brought that are on the back table.
They're all very low calorie.
Kind of like air.
Exactly like air.
I have to admit, I was while everybody was doing the survey, I was just doing a quick scan of who is in this room. Man, there are some of you like somebody I've carpooled with. There's some dirt in this room. I got to be careful.
Well, then you should partner up with me, Pat. I don't think we know each other at all. So
Justin, perfect. I love it.
I bring no judgment to our breakout room conversation.
That is good to know. Good to know. So I put in the chat, I stopped sharing the screen and there were some prompts on this slide, but I just put them in the chat. We're going to head into some breakout rooms. And the prompts, and again, prompts, as a teacher, I always said, these are my gift to you if you need something to break that awkward silence at the beginning, but feel free to go beyond them. Prompts are, what are you thinking and feeling right now? And I know I should share, half of my life, the first half was spent in Eugene, and I was shaped by that. So I do tend to have kind of a sensitivity that I say comes from Eugene. And so that notion, some of you might think that like, really, are we going to be talking about feelings? But as we do this work, this important anti-racist work, it's actually really important to tap into those feelings, specifically because for someone like me in white skin, that is something that I don't have to do very often when I'm talking about racism. I can approach racism without necessarily doing it from a standpoint of feelings because I don't feel the impact of it, at least in a way that I'm conscious of. And so I do want, I want you to challenge yourself if that's something you're not used to or accustomed to think about how you're feeling and how you're thinking. And then what might future conversations and work around race, racism, and anti-racism at Flex look and sound like. Before we go into breakout rooms, and I think Sarah's got those all set up for us. Sarah, if we maybe did we get about 4 people in each room?
Yes. If you don't join,
okay,
then I was miraculous, and I think we have 4 in every.
Okay, perfect.
But, sometimes when I do it, then there's like random people who didn't get assigned. So I tried.
Sure. We'll do our best. And way to go, math. So I'm thinking we'll take maybe 10 minutes with this one. And what I would ask you to do, coming here, while I get to say that I know many of you, I don't want to assume that you've gotten to a point of comfort with each other yet. So what I would maybe ask that you do in your breakout rooms is start with introductions. If you're comfortable sharing your name and things like your pronouns, if you want to share how you identify racially or ethnically, you can. And then be sure to engage in what I call equity of voice. And I was part of a training this summer that I absolutely loved, where they introduced something that was new to me, and it was a speaking order based on unearned privilege. And so they said, we're going to use a speaking order that is based on the amount of privilege that you might experience in your life, and offer those with less privilege to go first. Now, this one, part of why I might have loved it is because I was the only white male in the group. So what that said to me right off the bat is, oh, I'm going to go last. And so I didn't have to do any of that figuring out, which is yet another unearned privilege. Ooh, just got meta. So if you want to do that, you can decide. But what I would ask is that you honor equity of voice and make sure that everybody has a chance to share. And I'll say too, since some of this stuff might be kind of personal for you, share what you want to, and I would say don't share anything that is a level of vulnerable that you're not ready to engage in yet. Okay. Any questions before we head into the breakout rooms? Okay, Sarah, whenever you're ready, hit the button, and then we'll pull people back at about 2:45. All right, we'll wait till everybody comes back. And Sarah, I'm not seeing the thing that says how many folks are in the room right now. Do we have everybody back?
There's 18 people.
18, okay. Thank you. Thanks, Meredith.
Where did everyone else go?
I don't know.
We never got a notification, or it didn't close.
Oh,
I got a text from Nicole.
Yeah.
Oh,
I did it. Hold on. Now we have a minute. It's really
Gotcha.
the little things. I mean, you guys, I was asked specifically for my tech expertise on the mental health and suicide prevention to like help with one of the Zoom classes. Like literally my number one job was to get the meeting to YouTube Live and to record. Despite my practice with YouTube Live, it did not work how it did in the practice session. And then I got so flustered, I forgot to record.
It happens, Sarah. I'm
just showing the progress.
Some empathy. Yeah, for some empathy, I hosted the leadership summit right here in my home office. And as those of you who were there know, I owe you all a thank you, because I didn't realize how patient the audience was being with me, because when I went back and watched the recording, I saw how choppy my internet was, and it was embarrassing. So it was a testament to human kindness that the audience was so helpful. It looks 59. Like
we're at 59, yeah.
What's that? 69. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. And I know, similar to you all probably know, if you ever find the perfect amount of Zoom time for breakout rooms discussions, I found that the best ones are when they're too short and everybody pops in back at the last minute. I've been in a couple where they're too long and you're kind of in that awkward, like, we're going to look at each other for a little bit. And then there's all the in between. So if you know the perfect length, let me know. But hopefully you had some good conversations there. And then just so you know, for transparency, this survey is something that I've offered to Paul and Mike and Sarah. Like, this is something that hopefully becomes a living document that can be used to kind of see who among you would like to be part of doing the ongoing anti-racism planning work at Flex, and where you're at with that. So that's an important form of assessment. Any questions or comments that folks feel the need to get out before we move on? Okay. Again, feel free to just jump in and say it. So something I just wanted to share with you, and again, those of you who are familiar, if you've been part of the ELT, you've seen this a whole lot. We do have a page on TeacherSource dedicated to culturally relevant teaching resources. So this in the slide deck, which Paul, you've got access to it, and feel free to share it with folks if you want for all the links later. You can access this, and if you want to investigate some of those sources, you can. We're really, the focus of Beaverton's CRT practices are really based around these 10 practices that over the years, I was part of the team that got to help develop these 10, and some of you actually in this room were as well. And so that you know, they were developed by combining the research and literature that we had done, including folks like Ladson Billings and Geneva Gay and Pedro Noguera. We combined their research to try to focus on 10 strategies that we thought educators could use to develop their skills. The number 10 was significant and intentional. We figured let's make it something that's practical, 10 months in a school year. So we thought we could scaffold it that way. Building leaders, if they wanted to use this as a form of professional development, they could go through each process each strategy and practice one a month. And then it's also something, there's enough there that you can come back to it year after year. The one thing that's important to know is that there's an intentionality behind the ordering of them. So it's not a choose your own adventure where we want you to look at this and say like, oh, this looks fun and I'm just starting. Let's start with work in teams. The idea is they're really scaffolded. And so what we're going to focus on today is this practice one of know yourself. Because as some of you have probably experienced, to engage in anti-racist teaching, leadership, etc., without first doing the work of knowing yourself can actually be harmful despite the intent. We can actually cause harm to the students or our colleagues who we are trying to support if we don't do it with a little self-reflection first. So we're going to focus on that, and we're going to do that using something called the social identity groups and wheel. And here is where, again, I'm going to break from here to share a link with everybody. If this were a real life staff meeting in person, I would actually have paper copies of these for you and encourage you to do some writing on kind of a worksheet, but it's not. So let me share this with everybody. So you should be able to access this document. This particular version I have borrowed with love from the University of Michigan. Some might say stole, and that would be appropriate as well. Can I see a real or virtual thumbs up if folks were able to access this document? Okay, thanks. I saw Candace Paul. Perfect. It is not, unfortunately, a writable PDF. So I'm going to ask you just to kind of look at it and maybe think about what you would fill it in with. For context, up at the top it says implicit bias. Oops, sorry. Up at the top it says implicit bias, intentional learning and reflection. This is something, this version of this is one that I used last year with our HR department as we did an implicit bias in hiring workshop and session. So that's where that comes from. But like I said, this comes from the University of Michigan. This, for a little bit of context, this is an activity that actually I did with students for a long time. Part of what we looked at in 9th grade social studies at Westview was the role of culture in society. And so this was an activity that I did with students. It's something that I think, to be honest, our younger folks are sometimes better adept at identifying the various aspects of their identities than we adults are. This is something that they have grown up knowing, whereas for many of us, it's learning that we're doing. The idea of social identity groups comes from this notion that when we look at our identity, none of us belong to just one characteristic or trait. None of our identities are formed by that one. Rather, they're a composite of multiple identities. And so this list down here are some examples of the various types of identity. They are not exhaustive. They're simply examples. And then the examples that are given next to them, again, are not exhaustive. But you see that when we talk about identity, we need to take into consideration gender and sex and race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion or spirituality, social class, age, ability, national origin and citizenship, tribal affiliation, body type. I would also say language is an important aspect there. So all of the different things that form part of our identity. And I'll say again that as a white-skinned male in our society, these are things that I have been privileged with not having to think of very often. The first time I was aware of that was in a class myself. I think I was in middle school when I was asked to think about my culture. And as often happens sometimes with white folks, there's this, you get stymied a little bit. You're like, well, I don't have a culture. I'm just American, which is worthy of unpacking. What does that mean? Because I think we can argue there isn't a person on earth who isn't born with a culture. So this activity is fairly straightforward, but let me explain a couple things about it. If you had a pen or pencil and you had this in front of you, what I would ask you to do, to the extent that you're comfortable, is to fill in each of these boxes with whatever information you could. So if I were to do this, for example, age, I would say 29, just kidding, 48. Religion, you know, I was raised not, there was a period of time where mom tried to expose me to almost every religion or religious group that existed in Eugene, but none of them stuck. So I'm kind of in that, I don't know whether I'd say agnostic, but that's what I'd put there. Race, I identify as white. Ethnicity, mixed European, mostly Italian. Socioeconomic status, though it doesn't feel like it all the time. I think in the US, I'm middle class, if not maybe virgin a little up there. Gender is, I identify as cisgender. Sex, male. Orientation, straight. National origin, US citizen. I was born here. First language is English. I speak some Japanese as well. And I am, aside from some achy knees after years of running, pretty physically able. So those are the things that I would put in there. They don't necessarily need to be a single item for you. Some of you might have multiple racial identities, multiple ethnic identities, etc. So there is no right answer to this at all. The idea is once you have those, it's these questions in the middle that really make this activity more meaningful. So I would ask you to think about how you would respond to them. Number one says identities that you think about most often. And what you could actually do is write a number one next to those identities that you think about most often. I forget who it was who asked the question. Jason asked earlier about kind of my identity in this role. I would say lately, I tend to think about my race and my sex and gender most often, because in my role, those are the things that are foremost for me, but that hasn't been the case throughout my life. Number two says identities you think about least often. Number three is your own identities you would like to learn more about. That one can be tough for people. Maybe you've never thought about it. For myself, I actually grew up with the name Patrick Michael McCreery. I always assumed I was Irish. It wasn't until later that I learned there's no Irish there at all. And there's more Sicilian Italian than anything. So I'm kind of curious about that. Identities that have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself. And these are usually the ones I'd go further and say these are the parts of our identity that are important to us, right? The ones that shape how we see ourselves. And the number five, this one's equally important, identities that have the greatest effect on how others perceive you. And this again is where I will say that I have not had to think about this one very much in my life, unlike people who oftentimes know that their identities have a perception from other people that impacts them. So we're just going to ask you, we wanted to give you some time to engage in this activity. I know some of you have done this before, and here's where I'm going to be like the language arts teacher who will say there is always a time to reread a book and look for something new in it. Because identity and the characteristics of our identity are fluid and they oftentimes change different parts of our life, I'd say if you've done this before, give it another shot and see if anything has changed or if it stayed the same. And then what we're going to do is go into breakout rooms. And I think, Sarah, is it set up so that we can use the same breakout rooms? Okay, perfect. I was going to say a lot of times it's nice to have the same group that you're with that second time. And the prompts that I'll share again in the chat are what are you thinking and feeling right now? And how might your identity or identities play a role in your work as an educator? Interim students in a virtual classroom, but I would say that anybody working in education is an educator of some sort. So why don't we, let's do this. Why don't we go straight to, oops, my internet's unstable, so I'm gonna pause. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, why don't we go into breakout rooms? And then I would ask that maybe like we did last time, turn off your camera while you're engaging in the thought activity. And then when you're ready to begin discussion with your group, feel free to turn on your camera. Does that sound okay? Okay, so Sarah, if you want to hit breakout rooms, and we're at 3:03. This one can go a little, why don't we do 10 minutes and we'll check in. And if folks need more time, we can maybe do 12, 13 minutes. Does that sound?
Hey, Pat, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah. Yep.
So I can imagine if we were using this something along the lines of this with our students, I could imagine a student not being comfortable answering some of these boxes because that would put them in a vulnerable position to be talked about or etc. What would you suggest to somebody if just the act of not filling in the box would pose questions or make people wonder?
Oh, good. Yeah. Thank you, Paul. And I should say, like I'll say here, you are the only person who's going to see this in this case. Also, this is an activity that when I did it with students, I would let them know in advance whether they were going to have it be visible to other people. And so they are in control of what they share. They have agency there. I'll share this. I did it in a class called Diversity and Social Justice, where we actually did a lot of work building up to people feeling comfortable to being able to have those conversations. So I didn't really worry about that. I said, we're going to share this because that was part and parcel of the class. With a 9th grade global studies class, I would always preface it by saying, number one, this is not a worksheet that I'm going to collect and score. There is no right answer to this. There's no assessment to it. With that, whatever you put down is the right answer, and don't do anything that would make you uncomfortable. And don't worry about omission of anything being a cause for discomfort. Mostly it's about trying to set the context so that students feel comfortable and safe. Safety is probably the biggest one. And that's where I would say, like, I guess since I am talking to a group of folks who might think about using something like this in a classroom, do me a favor if you do, and think about the level of safety, the relationships that are in the room, the environment before you do this, because this is something, this is kind of why I did that first stab at letting you get to know me. This is something that requires a degree of trust and comfort before doing that. Does that answer that, Paul? Is that helpful?
Yep, thanks very much.
Perfect. All right. So Sarah, if you want to do breakout rooms, and then we'll aim for coming back about 3:05 or 3:15, maybe 3:20. Okay, it looks like we're all back. Is that right?
Not everyone.
Not everyone.
Sorry, no, it's okay. James would like to formally apologize. His internet quit. So if you were in James's breakout group, he sent me a panicked email that people know he wasn't just leaving in a huff.
Yeah, we lost Monica too. She disappeared.
Yeah, this is an uncomfortable conversation to have someone suddenly disappear, right? Like, oh my God, what do they say?
What they say.
No, it really is. And there's a certain, again, there's a number of things I haven't found the words for, but that notion of the feeling of losing somebody in Zoom is like a grief and a trauma that is terrible. I imagine when you see students disappear from classrooms, that can be kind of tough. My own daughter, I think, got booted out of her classroom earlier today. Thank you, though, for hopefully a rich conversation. Somebody just used a word that I want to make sure to point out. I was really moved earlier this year. I was meeting with a group of our colleagues who are involved in the Beaverton Multicultural Educator Community, BMEC, and some of you might be familiar with that as well. And they were talking about doing anti-racist equity work. And it was a reminder that somebody just said something that struck me. They said, you know, if it feels good to you, you're doing it wrong. It shouldn't feel good, right? We're trying to fix something that has caused a lot of damage. We're trying to fix the system that we're all part of. And my guess is, if I can assume a commonality among all of us that brought us here, everybody in this room came to this work because of a sense of wanting to serve, wanting to help, wanting to form relationships. And so when we learn that we're part of a system that's actually doing the opposite of what our intention is, that can be really uncomfortable. So I want to put that out there kind of as an affirmation that if in doing this work, you have moments where you feel uncomfortable, where you don't like it, just know that that's normal. I say that out loud to myself because if I don't, there are days where I'll admit I kind of feel like I don't know that I want to do this anymore. And then that's a day where, quite honestly, I remember the skin I'm in, and I'm like, as a white male, if I'm feeling this way, think about how others are feeling, and that is what keeps me going, because I have the privilege to think of other things. So thank you for doing that. And I also want to point out that this by no means is a comprehensive staff development session with everybody. My aim is to leave you maybe with more questions than you came in with, leave you feeling like there is still much more to do, because there by all means is. Are there any comments for the large group? I'm gonna risk, I know we're a large group of over 50, and so asking for comments can be dangerous, but does anybody want to share anything that came out of that discussion? I will make sure that it's yours to share and not somebody else's. Any stuff that came up for folks?
Well, I just want to mention that last tool that you had us use is actually a tool to also show the common similarities as well, to bring us closer as a group. Mm-hmm. And that same thing can happen within a classroom as well. And yes, maybe depending on the age, you don't have to include all of that. If you're doing it for like younger kids, it can change. But I know for like my high school health class, for sure, this is something that I'm going to implement. And so we actually found a commonality between me and another person in my group. And so it's just a way to open up others and to find that common ground, despite being brought up in a different background, culture, ethnicity, and race.
Thank you, Kendra. That's a fantastic point.
I would add on to that like just having someone else in the group say, oh, I share that, is so comforting. It's a very vulnerable and sometimes emotional, these conversations. And then sometimes I feel like I'm just being a big baby and I should get over it or something, like things that I have felt were not fair. So just having someone else, when we're willing to be vulnerable and say, me too, it's really helpful. It's really good feeling.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Willa. Any other thoughts?
I wanted to say that I found that there were moments I printed it because I ran into my printer and I got it printed so I could, because I'm a visual kid. And
oh, cool.
I found that the duality, the contrasts in some of these questions were very interesting because they forced me to find privilege. And by that, I mean that the identities where I have a strongest effect on how you perceive yourself were this one, and how identities have the greatest effect on how others perceive you, not how I want them to perceive me, but how they do perceive me, period, made me acknowledge that it was hard for me to acknowledge that the things that I don't value at all are things that carry great weight. And the things that I'm looking at for myself, have nothing to do with it. And that was hard to acknowledge. So I'm grateful we did this. It was very enlightening for me.
Thank you. And is it Janie? Janie. All right. Thank you, Janie, for sharing that and for being vulnerable. I want to suggest too that when you do this, not just with students, but with people, I'll say that the simple act of letting folks know, here's the thing, folks who carry with them on a daily basis an awareness of their racial, their ethnic, their gender identities, they know those things. They also often know that sometimes folks who look like me, white male, aren't aware of those. So sometimes doing an activity like this can be affirming simply in that it lets people know that you're aware of these things. I remember the first time I was affirmed in sharing my pronouns in a class. I had a student that day, it was the first day of school, and I just said, "Hi, I'm your teacher, Pat McCreery. I use he, him." It's that little 1 second thing that was an addition. I had a student come up to me later and entrusted me with the knowledge that they had just come out as transgender. And I asked, what on earth on the first day of school made you feel trust in me to share that? And they said, it's because you shared your pronouns, so I know that you know what's going on. And I was like, okay, so when we make those little moves, they can have an impact. They make a difference. Because the people who need to hear us say that and need to hear us or see us do that, they get it. So with that, I'll tell you what, I'm not even going to share my screen again because the last slide just says questions, answers, and then next steps. And that next steps is really a rhetorical question that's kind of for Paul and Mike and all of you to get to kind of consider where we go next. And I am happy to get to be part of that. All right. And oh my God. Yeah, Paul.
I just want to say thank you so much, Pat. This is great that we've had the opportunity. It's, as people who work remote the whole time, it just kills me that we can't ever be in the same room together or actually just sit and talk to each other. So this at least provided us a space to do that. So I really sincerely appreciate that. I do want to give ourselves a little bit of a shout out. I'm always so impressed with what I hear from the staff and how you guys engage and interact with each other. I can't thank you enough. And we're probably your only group ever that's been K through 12. So I think it's actually really interesting as well that sometimes we'll be in a group with people that are high school focused or middle school or elementary focused, and how they approach the work is going to be so different because their audience is so different. So I think it's really cool that we get the chance to talk to each other from different levels. So yeah, I just want to thank you again. I appreciate it. And I'll stop talking because I do that a lot.
Well, I'm right there with you, Paul. Any questions you have for me? All right. Like I said, and some of you have heard me say this a lot, I am proud of that population of 1 in the Office of Equity and Inclusion. I am also proudly working to expand it, either in number of people. Don't worry, Paul, I'm not trying to recruit from your staff. Either in number of people or in capacity throughout the district. I am really excited about where we're going as a district. Though it's going to be long. We've got 40,000 students and 5,000 staff, and that's a lot of hearts and minds to work on. But I'm excited to do it, and I am an open book in terms of questions and ways that I can support you, and offers of help for anybody who wants to, because this isn't work that anybody can do alone. So thank you. And Paul, I'm gonna stop right there because there's 2 minutes left, and if I get to be the guy who ends a staff meeting 2 minutes early and gets a little credibility for that, I'll take it.
As you should. I'd have to ask, is Vince here? Because Vince, I don't know if you know Vince on our team, our communication specialist. We started something today. He plays the guitar to end our meetings.
Oh.
And today he did that, and it was just absolutely, and thank you, Sarah, for the suggestion. It was absolutely amazing. So somebody go ahead.
He is working on something else, I think.
Okay. So I've sang to the group too many times. I'm not going to pretend to sing a guitar. So there you go. Have a great afternoon.
Bella has a ukulele.
Oh, there you go.